It began not with gunfire, but with silence. A silence unfamiliar to men who had lived through the thunder of artillery, the scream of Stukas, the endless hum of engines that marked the dying years of the Reich. For the first time in years, they could hear the wind. They were no longer soldiers of a conquering army. They were prisoners, and as the transport ship rolled across the gray Atlantic toward the eastern seaboard of the United States, hundreds of German POWs leaned on the railings, staring into the horizon, wondering what awaited them in the land they had been told was crude, chaotic, and unrefined. Many expected humiliation, perhaps cruelty. They'd seen what the Allies had done to German cities. Hamburg flattened, Dresden a sea of fire, Cologne reduced to ruins. If America had done that from across an ocean, what would it do now that they were in its hands? Yet, as the skyline of New York appeared through the morning haze, the first emotion was not fear, but awe. It wasn't the chaos they'd been warned of. It was order. Vast, humming, impossibly vast order. They saw the Statue of Liberty rise through the fog, the sun glinting off her torch. For some, it was the first time they realized that the enemy they Burpandi fought was not a faceless machine. It was a civilization, confident, youthful, and impossibly energetic. Beneath the decks, the guards, most barely older than the prisoners themselves, moved with quiet professionalism. They spoke politely, even when firm. It confused the Germans. They had expected vengeance. Instead, they were treated like men, not monsters. When the ship docked, the sight awaiting them was unlike anything they had imagined. Trains stretched endlessly along the harbor. Cranes moved cargo with precision that seemed choreographed. Dock workers, women among them, coordinated with soldiers, civilians, and engineers in a seamless flow of efficiency. The German officers exchanged silent glances. They had been told America was soft, that its soldiers were amateurs and its factories wasteful. What they saw here was a nation mobilized beyond comprehension. Their journey continued inland. The trains rolled west, through cities that seemed untouched by war. Chicago, St. Louis, Dallas, names they had only read on maps. From the windows they watched landscapes change like scenes from a film reel. Steel mills breathing smoke into the horizon, endless fields of wheat bending under the wind, convoys of trucks flowing along newly built highways. The scale of it all stunned them. This was a country that had never seen invasion, never faced bombing, and yet it was producing more tanks, planes, and ammunition than the entire Axis combined. At Camp Swift in Texas, the guards lined the Germans up in the baking sun. The air shimmered with heat. Yet even here, in the middle of nowhere, the camp was organized with precision. Barracks of fresh timber, water towers, kitchens, infirmaries, even theaters. They were prisoners, yes, but prisoners in a system that seemed designed for efficiency, not punishment. One of the men, Obergefreiter Wilhelm Kruger, a tank mechanic from Hanover, couldn't believe what he saw when assigned to a nearby lumber mill. American saws roared with a mechanical rhythm far beyond anything he'd known in Europe. Conveyor belts moved logs effortlessly. Machines did the work of 50 men. He whispered to a fellow prisoner, "Now I understand how they built all those Shermans." It was a quiet admission, but one shared by many. For years, German propaganda had painted the United States as a nation of soft consumers, jazz musicians and assembly line workers who could never match the discipline of the Wehrmacht. But here, in the dust of Texas, surrounded by endless machinery, the myth began to crumble. They realized they hadn't been defeated by numbers alone, but by something deeper, an industrial and organizational strength unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Some of the POWs were later transferred north to camps in Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota. They were astonished by the land's fertility, by the sheer abundance of food. Cornfields stretched beyond sight. Trains rolled past filled with grain, beef, and produce. They were given meals that, to them, felt luxurious. Meat, vegetables, bread still warm. One prisoner wrote in a letter later intercepted by censors, "We are treated better here than our own soldiers at the front." That letter was never sent, but it reflected a sentiment quietly shared across the camps. The United States, despite being their enemy, had shown them a strange kind of dignity. In return, many worked diligently in assigned labor: farms, canneries, logging, even factory repairs. They were paid small wages, could buy cigarettes, soap, or postcards. Some camps allowed orchestras and theater performances. Others held language classes. For men who had lived through the collapse of their nation, it felt surreal. But the real shock came when some of them saw America's war production firsthand. In late 1944, select POWs with engineering backgrounds were assigned to supervised labor in industrial zones. Not weapons factories, but maintenance depots, rail yards, and supply warehouses. They saw assembly lines running day and night. Women operated cranes, men repaired engines with tools so standardized that parts were interchangeable across entire divisions. To a German trained in craftsmanship and precision, it was unthinkable that such mass production could maintain quality. Until they saw it with their own eyes. One former Luftwaffe mechanic, Erich Baumann, later wrote after Repatriation, "When I saw how an American engine was made, piece by hundreds of hands, I knew the war was lost long before we crossed the Atlantic. We could never match that." His words echoed what historians would later confirm. By 1944, the U.S. produced more war material than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. The POWs began to grasp the scale of it, not as numbers in reports, but as living reality. They saw endless lines of trucks, crates of spare parts, and fuel stored in tanks that seemed to stretch to the horizon. They realized every Sherman they had burned in the Ardennes was replaced within days. Every bomber shot down was built anew before the week's end. The American war machine was not just powerful, it was inexhaustible. Still, life as a prisoner was a study in contradictions. They were watched constantly, fenced in by barbed wire, yet treated with restraint. There were moments of homesickness, despair, and guilt. Some received word that their families in Germany had perished under Allied bombing. Others wrestled with the moral weight of what they'd fought for. But amid all that, something unexpected grew: understanding. They listened to American radio in guarded recreation halls. They heard swing music, political debates, news about elections, concepts foreign to men who had lived under dictatorship. They watched as black soldiers guarded the camp gates, something unthinkable in Nazi Germany. The experience chipped away at the walls of ideology that had defined their youth. In Camp Clinton, Mississippi, a group of captured U-boat officers were shown footage of the Buchenwald concentration camp after liberation. The silence that followed was heavy and long. Some turned away. Others demanded proof. The guards offered no lectures. They simply played the film again. By the third showing, few spoke. For many, it was the first time the reality of the Reich they'd served became undeniable. By war's end in 1945, more than 370,000 German POWs were held across the United States. Most would be repatriated between 1946 and 1947. When they finally boarded ships home, they left behind the camps that had confined them. And yet, many felt they were leaving something more profound. They had glimpsed a society that had defeated them not only with weapons, but with spirit and organization. For months after returning to Germany, some found it hard to speak about America. Their country lay in ruins, cities hollowed out, families scattered. And in that devastation, they remembered the clean barracks, the steady meals, the calm discipline of their guards. It wasn't pride that lingered, it was humility, and, for some, quiet admiration. Historians later noted how the American treatment of German POWs became one of the most effective tools of post-war reconciliation. It showed that victory did not require cruelty, and that strength could coexist with humanity. For men raised under the shadow of totalitarianism, that realization was transformative. In 1946, near a small camp in Arkansas, a group of German prisoners carved a monument before their release. It bore no flags, no emblems, only a simple inscription: "To those who showed us mercy." The monument still stands today, weathered but intact, a silent testament to an unexpected encounter between enemies. Years later, when asked what shocked them most about America, many former POWs didn't mention the size of the factories, or the food, or even the freedom. They spoke of something subtler: the confidence of a nation that believed it could rebuild anything, including its enemies. In their memories, the rhythmic clang of American machinery became something more than noise. It was the sound of a world being remade. A reminder that wars are not only fought with guns, but with ideas, and with the quiet conviction that decency itself can be a weapon. They had come to America as prisoners of war. They left as witnesses to the power that would define the next century. Not just the industrial might of a nation, but the moral strength that underpinned it. And as their ships carried them eastward toward a shattered homeland, the last thing many remembered was not the fences or the guards, but the sight of those endless factories fading into the horizon, lit by the glow of furnaces that never seemed to die out. Because for them, that glow was the final truth of the war. They had fought a country that could not be bombed into submission, nor broken by fear. A country that had forged victory not only in steel, but in the quiet, relentless belief in its own future.